All right, well, let's talk about what to look for in the numbers when the federal budget comes next week. Pedro Antunes is Chief Economist for the Conference Board of Canada. Mostafa Askari is Chief Economist for the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Welcome to you both. Now, we heard the Finance Minister telling reporters today that no, the deficit is not going up. She's repeating her message that the government is on a fiscally sustainable path, that the government is committed to the fiscal guideposts that it laid out last year. Now, Pedro, when you open up that budget document next week and you actually start to parse the numbers, the hard data, what are you going to be looking for?
Well, I'm actually a little surprised that we're not going to be adding to the deficit. Perhaps there's a little bit more fiscal room to maneuver on the revenue side. Perhaps there's some surprises there. But we've certainly seen a lot of money announced, a lot of it within the next 5 years, within the 5-year planning timeline of the budget. So yeah, where are the revenues coming up to kind of match those additional expenditures? And I think if we are going to keep to those guideposts, you know, we are still in a situation where we're running deficits, you know, when the economy really is at full employment. And, you know, we would certainly urge that we ease up on the spending, you know, here at this point. Okay,
Mostafa, let me get your thoughts on that, on what you're going to be looking for in terms of revenue, expenses, and what the government's overall fiscal health is here.
Yeah, I think having a sort of a fixed deficit not changing could be done through different ways. Whether they're going to raise revenues or not, we don't really know. And if they are going to raise revenues, in which part of revenues, and they're saying that they're not going to raise middle taxes, but then it could be high tax increases, it could be wealth tax, could be anything else, that we will be looking for that. And the other part of this is that not a lot of people actually talk about this, is the deficit itself is not as important as the primary balance. And not a lot of people talk about the primary balance, which is revenues minus program spending, excluding the debt charges, because that really has importance for their actually guidepost, the debt to GDP ratio, which is their targeting. And if you have a primary surplus, that makes it much easier to actually deal with that and seeing a debt to GDP ratio coming down.
And, you know, again, as you mentioned, Pedro, we've already seen billions of dollars promised over the last couple of weeks. Housing, AI innovation, defense, affordability. When you're actually looking at the numbers in the budget on some of that spending that's already announced, what are you looking for in terms of how that spending gets broken down?
Well, it's how it's broken down. I think obviously there's a big focus on housing and you know, affordability. These are important issues, but again, what are going to be the constraints on the economy side? Do we have the workers and et cetera to kind of match those initiatives? But what am I going to look for? I think it's the timing of a lot of these measures. We know a lot of the defense measures you know, are spanning over 20 years. I suspect they'll be you know, tail end loaded. We won't see a whole lot of spending up front. And that's maybe the plan that the government has to keep the deficit in line with kind of previous announcements, in line with their targets.
Right, and Mostafa, we have seen provincial governments tabling their budgets so far this year, and you know, they've been accounting for inflation and interest rates and lower revenue projections. So there's been a lowering of a fiscal outlook, but there still is this desire to spend on cost of living measures, for instance. Mm-hmm. So should we expect more of the same when we see that federal document?
I think they will have something for cost of living. They definitely, I mean, they have been talking about this. On the other measures that they have announced, I think one has to be careful, as was mentioned. If it is their capital spending for defense, those things have to be amortized over a long period of time, so they won't affect the current deficit. If there are loans, the loans they go on the balance sheet. They're not the you know, spending right away unless there's a default on the loans, which will happen in the future. So those kind of things we have to sort of look at and see exactly how those things are planned, and whether it's a capital spending, whether it's the current spending in the next couple of years, and those things will affect the profile for the bottom line.
Now, Pedro, one issue that's been getting a lot of attention is productivity. We've heard economists talk about it. We've heard the Bank of Canada talk about it, that it's resembling a national emergency, especially compared to what's happening in the American economy. So what should we expect on that front in the budget?
Well, I hope it's more of an issue around what we shouldn't see, or what we're hoping not to see. And if we go back to that speech that the deputy governor made, I mean, the number one issue was the amount of physical capital. In other words, the amount of investment that we're seeing by the private sector. If we go to one of the bigger challenges around that, why are we not attracting private investment? Is because we're no longer competitive on corporate taxes. So I think we have to be very careful around what we do on corporate taxes, not to have that that unwanted or undesired effect on investment. Our investment is a laggard in comparison to other jurisdictions. So I think that's, to me, the easiest piece that we can address in terms of making ourselves more competitive to private investment, to address that productivity challenge.
And Mostafa, I do want to just stay on the overall economy and how that relates to the budget, because the budget as always includes forecast numbers that come from the private sector, a survey. And we have the Bank of Canada saying yesterday that economic growth is picking up this year. Inflation is still too high, even though it's easing. We may see an interest rate cut in a couple of months in June. What's your sense of the economic outlook for Canada and what it's going to mean for the government's fiscal path?
Well, I think definitely based on the sort of the numbers that we have seen, the monthly numbers, it is going to be stronger than what people expected, a few months ago and at the time of the fall economic statement. And private sector forecasters are going to probably upgrade their forecast, or they have already done that, so the budget will reflect that. That obviously will provide a little bit more room for the government to play with on the fiscal side. My hope is that they don't use up all that room. I mean, that's what they have been doing in the past, that every time they get a sort of a positive surprise on the revenue side, they tend to use that up. And hopefully they're going to be a little bit more careful with the programs that they are going to propose.
All right, lots to watch for next Tuesday. Pedro Antunes and Mostafa Askari, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure, Andrew.
Great. It was a pleasure.